There are moments in life when silence feels sacred. A church pew, a cemetery, a quiet morning when the kettle whistles for one instead of two. And then there are moments when silence is a weapon. That night, the dining room was so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock behind me. Camille had set the table with the good plates. White porcelain with gold trim, the ones Thomas always said made even grocery store chicken feel like a feast. They glowed beneath the chandelier like nothing had changed. Except, of course, everything had. It had been exactly 1 week since we buried my husband. 39 years of marriage reduced to a black suit, a line of casseroles, and one folded flag. I hadn't cried at the funeral. Not because I wasn't devastated, but because I knew, somewhere deep beneath the grief, that the real mourning would begin when the crowds thinned and the house turned quiet. And tonight, at this dinner table, it was finally quiet enough to hear what people really thought. Camille sat across from me, delicately slicing her salmon with the knife I gave her last Christmas. Her expression was polite, controlled, familiar in the way that strangers sometimes are when they're pretending to be family. She hadn't looked me in the eye once all evening. If this story reaches you, let me know where you are in the world. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far my story has reached. Trevor sat to her left, always the head of the table, always the head of everything. His wineglass was half full, his tie loosened just enough to suggest casual authority. He hadn't spoken since we sat down. Not really. He'd asked if I wanted sparkling or still. That was the extent of his hospitality. And then, as if someone had given him a silent cue, he cleared his throat. "Well," he said, setting his fork down gently, "Camille and I wanted to speak with you about next steps." I blinked. "Next steps?" He smiled, the kind of smile you give a tenant whose lease you don't plan to renew. "Yes. Now that Thomas is gone, we imagine you'll want some time to mourn, of course." "Of course," Camille echoed, still not looking at me. "But once that's done, we think it's best you start considering what's next. Where you'll go. What kind of arrangements make the most sense." I didn't understand. Or rather I did, but I didn't want to. "I don't follow," I said quietly. Trevor's eyes didn't waver. "Evelyn, this house is far too large for one person, and frankly too expensive. Utilities, maintenance, upkeep, none of it's practical anymore. We've been talking, and we think it's time." "Time for what?" I asked, though I already knew. "To move on," he said. "To move out." My knife clinked against the plate. I hadn't realized I'd set it down. "You're suggesting I leave my own home?" My voice didn't tremble, but something inside me did. Trevor didn't flinch. "Mourn if you must. But yes, then, leave." I looked to Camille, my daughter, my only child, the one I used to rock to sleep when she had earaches and night terrors. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even frowning. Instead, she finally met my eyes. "You were always Dad's burden," she said, calm as a funeral hymn. "Never mine." There it was. The honesty grief had carved out of them like a scalpel. Sharp, clean, cruel. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember putting down my napkin or pushing in the chair. I don't remember walking to the door, but I remember the sound of my shoes against the hardwood. Soft, steady, almost elegant. I didn't shout, I didn't plead, I didn't cry. I simply left. Because grief makes people distant. But betrayal? Betrayal makes them honest. And once people show you who they are, there's no forgetting it. Not even in mourning. Especially not in mourning. Grief doesn't always look like sobbing on the floor. Sometimes it's just standing at your own front door, hand on the knob, not remembering how you got there. I stood in the entryway for a long time that night. Purse still over my shoulder, shoes still on. My coat hung crooked from one arm like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to stay or go. Much like me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the refrigerator, that old rattling thing Thomas kept meaning to replace, had gone still. Like it too had heard what was said at dinner and decided not to interrupt. I took a slow breath, then walked toward the stairs. My knees ached. The railing felt colder than usual beneath my palm. Each step creaked, a familiar complaint of old wood, but tonight it sounded different. like the house was whispering something I didn't want to hear. I walked into our bedroom. Number not ours, not anymore. The lamp on the nightstand glowed low and golden. It was the kind of light Thomas used to call forgiving. Dim enough to hide wrinkles, soft enough to make anyone look younger. That man always had a way of softening what hurt. But he wasn't here to soften this. His reading glasses were still on the dresser. His slippers by the bed, angled just the way he left them the night before the heart attack. I sat on the edge of the mattress slowly, like if I moved too quickly, the grief would catch up. And it did. Not loudly. Not with tears or screaming. Just wait. Like someone had placed a stone slab on my chest and asked me to breathe through it. That dinner scene played in my head like a broken reel. Trevor's voice too smooth. Camille's eyes too dry. You were always Dad's burden. Never mine. Funny. I'd raised her better than that. Or at least I thought I had. I walked out without a word, but my silence was not surrender. It was recalibration. A moment to retreat and reassess. Like when a storm catches you mid-garden and you know better than to keep digging. You go inside, you wait, and you plan. I pulled the Afghan up over my lap. The one Thomas's sister crocheted for our 25th anniversary. It had started to unravel at the edges. I'd meant to fix it. Now I wasn't sure I would. Maybe some things are meant to fall apart when their purpose is done. Thomas had warned me about this. Not directly, never in a way that would alarm me, but in the little ways, those nudges masked as casual remarks. Don't sign anything without reading it first, Eve. Never rely on what people say at holidays. Rely on what they do when no one's watching. Keep copies. Trust the paper, not the promise. At the time, I thought he was just being cautious. Or maybe protective in that overbearing way husbands can be when they've read one too many articles about scams and identity theft. But now? Now I could hear the subtext he'd never said aloud. He'd seen something in Camille, in Trevor. Or maybe he'd simply seen what grief does to people, the way it opens the door to resentment, entitlement, truth. And so he'd prepared. For something. For this? I looked at his drawer. He kept everything organized, paper-clipped, labeled, filed, bank statements, mortgage notes, insurance documents. I used to tease him about it. What's all this for, Thomas? You planning to pass on and leave me a homework assignment? He'd smile, fold the drawer closed, and say, No, sweetheart, I'm planning to pass on and leave you protected. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I wasn't so sure it had been a joke. I glanced toward the desk. The manila folders were still there, untouched, undisturbed. Trevor and Camille thought I was drifting in the fog of mourning. But what they didn't realize, what they hadn't accounted for, was that I'd spent nearly 40 years watching a man who built his entire life around preparation. And I'd learned more than they thought. My heart still ached. Of course it did. But beneath the ache was something else forming, slowly, quietly, like steel cooling into shape. Resolve. They wanted me to be confused, dismantled, disposable. But I wasn't. I was Thomas Barrett's wife, and that meant something still. Tomorrow I'd start looking through the files. Tomorrow I'd call the bank. Tomorrow they'd learn that the woman they tried to nudge out the door had already stepped into a different room, one with locks they didn't have keys to. The next morning I ironed my blouse. It didn't need ironing really, but I needed something to press, something to flatten, something I could control. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender water and starch, like a version of myself from 20 years ago. A woman who packed lunchboxes, ran church fundraisers, and believed, naively, that good families stayed good. I slipped on my coat, picked up my worn leather handbag, and locked the door behind me. Not because I thought Camille or Trevor would barge in again, but because locking the door made it mine, if only for another day. The bank sat on the corner of Main and Rosemont, 2 blocks from the post office and 3 from the grocery store where Thomas used to make a scene over overpriced peaches. I could still hear his voice, light-hearted and fake outraged. They better be gold-plated for that price, Eve. That voice had filled our car rides, our weekends, our life. And then it didn't. The bank lobby was warm and over-perfumed, like someone had sprayed too much lemon polish and tried to cover it up with lilies. A young man in a maroon tie asked if I had an appointment. I gave him the name I knew would get me through the door. "Mrs. Patterson, please." "Helen Patterson?" He smiled, typed something into a tablet, and nodded. "She'll be with you in just a moment, Mrs. Barrett. Would you like coffee or tea while you wait?" "No, thank you. I just need answers." He blinked, nodded again, disappeared. A few moments later, Helen appeared, just as I remembered her. Hair set into soft curls, a pearl pin on her blazer, eyes that understood things before you said them. "Evelyn," she said, voice gentle but steady. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you, Helen." I forced a small smile. "He always liked talking to you more than me. Said you had a better sense of humor." She chuckled. "He wasn't wrong. Come on back." We walked into her office, where the blinds were half closed against the morning sun. A fern drooped slightly in the corner, too well watered or not enough. I couldn't tell. That's the trouble with quiet things. You only notice when they start to bend. "I need to understand what's left," I said as I sat down. "Thomas handled everything. I don't even know where to begin." Helen's expression softened. "Of course, I can walk you through it." She began typing. Her nails clicked rhythmically against the keyboard, then stopped. What is it?" She tilted the monitor slightly, frowning, not in concern but in curiosity. "There are more accounts here than I expected." "More?" "Yes. Well, there's your joint checking, of course, and a savings account. That's standard. But I'm also seeing a CD in your name, a money market account, and—" She paused, scrolling. "Evelyn, there's a living trust. It was established 5 years ago. You're listed as the sole beneficiary." I blinked. "A trust?" Helen nodded. "It's not unusual, especially when someone wants to simplify asset transfers or protect financial arrangements. But based on the structure, this wasn't casual. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing." My heart pounded. I didn't know whether to be grateful or hurt. Maybe both. "He never told me." "That's not uncommon either," she said gently. "Some spouses prefer to shield the other from complexity or conflict." I thought of Camille and Trevor, of that dinner table and their waiting eyes, of their confidence that I would just fold. "And the accounts?" I asked slowly. "They're in my name?" "All of them," Helen said, printing out a series of statements and sliding them across the desk. There were small, consistent transfers, nothing flashy, but methodical, intentional. He wasn't just saving, he was insulating. The numbers were more than I expected, modest but solid, enough to give me space, enough to stall whatever plans they were already drafting behind my back. Why didn't he just tell me? Helen looked at me, then at the window behind me, where the light was beginning to pierce the blinds. "Maybe he did," she said softly. "Not with words, but with documents, with deposits, with the kind of preparation you don't do unless you love someone enough to imagine they might one day be alone and still need to stand." I sat back in the chair, the paper warm beneath my fingertips. He left me love, but also something more, preparation, and it might just be enough. I drove home from the bank with a folder on the passenger seat and a headache blooming behind my eyes. The folder was pale blue, labeled neatly in Mrs. Patterson's handwriting. Beneficiary documents, Evelyn Barrett. But it could have just as easily said, everything they didn't know. The sun was low when I pulled into the driveway. It hit the front windows at just the right angle to cast long shadows inside, soft, stretched, like memories that didn't want to leave. Neither did I. But I knew now the house was no longer mine in the way they thought it was. Not a gift they could claim, not a favor to be revoked. Thomas had made sure of that. I set the folder down on the kitchen table, beside the vase where wilted funeral lilies still held on, their petals browned at the edges. The whole place smelled like old water and silence. Funny how silence can change. Last night, It had felt hollow. Today, it felt full, like it was holding something for me. Something I wasn't ready to name yet, but could feel coming closer. I poured tea and sat down. No television, no music, just me, the folder, and the kettle ticking as it cooled. Page after page I read. A copy of our joint savings account, predictable, modest, comforting. A cushion for grocery bills and car repairs, the kind of account we used to forget about because it was always just enough. Then the money market statement, more significant than I expected. It held transfers made steadily over 7 years. Small amounts, quiet deposits, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. And Thomas had been looking closely. Beneath that, the trust documents. My name, not ours. My signature, dated, witnessed, notarized. A business trust established in 2019. Thomas had set up a legal structure to hold the company he once claimed to have retired from. I remembered the day he said he was done with it all. Just wanted to fish, read, tinker with the water heater even when it wasn't broken. Retired? Number? He just stepped back quietly, like a stagehand slipping behind the curtain. He let the lights dim while still pulling every string. I kept reading. Real estate assets. Not plural by accident. The documents outlined property holdings managed through the trust, including a small cottage on the northern coast, one I'd never even seen. The deed was tucked in with a sticky note in Thomas's handwriting. For Evelyn, when quiet becomes a choice. I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the words like they might float off the paper and speak for him. He'd done all of this. Dozens of signatures, filings, transfers, and never once made me feel like I should worry. While I was busy hosting birthday dinners and folding laundry, Thomas was building a fortress. Brick by brick, paper by paper. I'd been a bystander to my own protection plan, and Camille had no idea. Trevor, for all his calculations and smug efficiency, had no idea. They thought I was drifting in grief, that I'd crumble if they pushed just a little harder. But the foundation they were so eager to bulldoze wasn't theirs. It never had been. It was in my name. Mine. I looked around the kitchen, at the ceramic rooster Thomas had hated, at the little magnet Camille brought back from Paris when she was 20 and still called me Mom without flinching, at the pale yellow paint we chose together because it reminded me of spring. They saw a house full of aging wallpaper and outdated fixtures. I saw something else now. Leverage. And the terrifying thing, for them, was that I hadn't even used it yet. I stacked the papers back into the folder, careful, deliberate, like handling something sacred. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after. But I knew one thing. Trevor and Camille were playing a game I hadn't even joined yet. And I was holding the rule book. Not because I asked for power, not because I sought revenge, but because Thomas Barrett, my husband, my quiet strategist, had loved me enough to plan for the worst in others, while giving me the best of himself. That, I was beginning to understand, was what real protection looked like. Not armor, not walls, but a paper trail in your name, and a pen waiting in your hand. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Not because I'd slept well, I hadn't, but because my body had learned, somewhere deep in the quiet of widowhood, that staying still was no longer the same as resting. By 6 o'clock, I was showered, dressed, and seated at the dining table with a legal pad in front of me. Black coffee on one side, Thomas's old calculator on the other. I never knew why he kept it. It had half the buttons rubbed blank and still beeped like it was made in the 80s. But it was his. And somehow that made it precise enough for me. I'd spent the night turning the same thought over and over in my mind. If I owned a trust, and the trust owned the business, what exactly did I own? Helen had said the words gently. The business assets are technically part of the trust structure, Evelyn, and you're the sole beneficiary. At the time, I nodded like I understood, but I didn't, not really. Not until I found a document in the folder marked Barrett Property Group, Reorganization 2019, and under that, stapled and highlighted, Managing Trust Owner, Evelyn Barrett. not co-signer. Not next of kin, owner. Thomas never said a word. The same man who once left me 3 voicemails about a sale on garden mulch had created a full legal framework to transfer a business without so much as a hint. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. I picked up the phone. The name at the bottom of the last trust ledger was one I vaguely recognized, Darla Lewis. Darla had worked with Thomas for over 15 years, first as a receptionist, and then as some kind of junior manager when the firm downsized. I hadn't seen her since our 30th anniversary party, where she gave us a houseplant I accidentally killed within the week. I dialed her number from the directory page. It rang twice. Barrett Property Group, came the voice, bright and composed. Darla speaking. I hesitated. Darla, it's Evelyn Barrett. A beat. Then her tone shifted completely. Mrs. Barrett, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I heard about Mr. Barrett. We were all devastated. He was just the best man I've ever worked for. I closed my eyes for a moment. Thank you, Darla. That means more than you know. Of course. Is everything okay? I didn't answer right away. I have some questions about the business. Another pause, shorter this time. Of course, anything you need. Within the hour, I was parked outside the old storefront office on Maple and 8th, the same one Thomas had refused to renovate because he said, clients like a little rust. The sign above the door still read Barrett Property Group, though one of the T's in property had slipped a little, giving it a slight tilt, like it, too, was leaning on something for support. Darla greeted me with watery eyes and a tight hug. She looked older than I remembered, gray streaks at the temple, a deeper line between her brows. But then again, I probably looked the same. She led me into the back conference room and handed me a stack of folders. We've kept it running, she said softly. Mr. Barrett set everything up before he stepped away. He appointed me interim operations manager and left standing instructions. He told me if anything ever happened, I'd be hearing from you. From me? I blinked. She nodded. You're the trust holder. You own the company, Mrs. Barrett. It's yours. I sank into the leather chair, the weight of that sentence pressing against my spine like an extra set of bones. They thought I owned grief. I also owned the ledger. Profit reports, rental property summaries, contract renewals, steady income, nothing flashy but consistent. The business hadn't slowed down in 5 years. If anything, it had stabilized. Leaner, smarter, less risk, more return. Thomas hadn't retired. He'd just restructured and made sure the wheels kept turning. Have Camille or Trevor ever contacted the office? I asked, flipping through quarterly summaries. Darla pursed her lips. Trevor called twice. Both times he asked for financial overviews and tried to schedule a meeting as the family representative. I told him all communication had to go through the trust holder. And he didn't know who that was? He assumed it was Camille, she said, and then, a bit drier, he assumed a lot. I closed the folder, ran my hand across the cover. I wasn't sure what came next. Not exactly. But I knew now that when they said I didn't belong, when they assumed I had nothing, they were wrong. I had the business. I had the trust. I had the truth. And they were about to learn just how different that was from sentiment. I never liked beige folders, too neutral, too quiet. The kind of color that looked like it had nothing to hide, until you opened it. Darla handed me one that morning with both hands. No explanation, no disclaimer. Just the file and the same quiet look I'd seen on Helen Patterson's face the day before. That expression women wear when they know something unpleasant, but also know you're strong enough to hear it. This came up when I was pulling the last 5 years of records, she said, folding her hands. You might want to see it. Inside, a series of documents, contracts mostly, all properly dated, notarized, initialed, every single one signed by Trevor Thornton. The first one was from 4 years ago. Title, Residential Partnership, Kitchen Renovation Loan. I remembered that phase. Camille had called it upgrading the resale value. I'd called it ripping out perfectly good tile. The amount? $12,000. I flipped to the next one. Capital Infusion, Real Estate Investment LLC. Amount, $18,500. And the next. Bridge Loan, Short-Term Partnership Arrangement. $9,200. The list went on. 6 documents in total. Amounts varied. Justifiable if you weren't paying attention. If you assumed Thomas was just helping his son-in-law get ahead. But together, $61,375. Trevor hadn't just borrowed from the business. He'd bled it, bit by bit, dressed up in jargon and paperwork that assumed no one would ever look too closely. They borrowed from the business, I said aloud, though mostly to myself. They never planned to pay. Darla nodded slowly. Thomas insisted we keep everything formal. No cash handouts, every cent documented. He said if family ever came knocking, we'd need proof of what was taken and what was owed. I turned back to the pages. Each loan had clear terms, repayment schedules, interest rates, modest but firm, 30-day grace periods, quarterly invoices. And next to every due date, the same handwritten note from Darla, no payment received. Has Trevor ever acknowledged any of this? I asked. Not once, she replied. He always referred to them as internal arrangements. Said Thomas understood the nature of modern finance. Modern finance, I repeated, almost laughing. Is that what we're calling theft with paperwork now? Darla didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her silence agreed. I stared at Trevor's signature. Neat cursive. A man who prided himself on presentation. A man who probably thought that the absence of consequences was the same as forgiveness. He thought no one would ever check, I said quietly. He assumed no one could, Darla corrected. He never once asked to speak to you, never considered you might have the authority. I thought back to that dinner. The certainty in his voice, the entitlement, the suggestion that grief made me irrelevant. An old woman to be ushered off the stage with a polite nod and a nudge toward assisted living brochures. They'd planned it. Maybe not the cruelty, but certainly the convenience. Camille would inherit the house. Trevor would inherit the business. And I? I was just supposed to vanish between casseroles and condolence cards. But the ledger didn't lie, and neither did my name on those trust documents. What happens if someone defaults on these loans? I asked. Darla pulled out a separate folder, yellow this time, like caution. Per the original agreements, the debt remains enforceable under the business code. You, as the legal trustee and business owner, have the right to pursue repayment. And if I don't? Well, she said carefully, then the business absorbs the loss. But it sets a precedent. That family debts don't matter. That signatures mean nothing. I looked again at Trevor's signature. It meant something now. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the rules I'd been living under without realizing I was in the game. I'd been married to a man who built houses and businesses the same way, slowly, steadily, and with blueprints only he fully understood. But this one he built for me. And for the first time, I was seeing the walls, the structure, the steel beams hidden behind everyday conversation and deferred questions. Camille and Trevor thought I owned memories, but I also owned the math, the paper, the unpaid balance with interest. And just like that, I stopped feeling guilty for opening the folders he left behind, because I wasn't digging for dirt. I was standing on the foundation he'd already poured. Now all that remained was deciding how to collect. The knock came at 8:47 a.m. Not that I was watching the clock, but I remember the time because I was halfway through pouring the hot water over my tea leaves, and I never let them steep more than 5 minutes. They didn't wait for me to open the door. By the time I reached it, Camille was already stepping inside, her heels clicking across the entryway like she owned the floor. Trevor followed, all business casual authority, holding a folder under one arm and a travel mug under the other. "Good morning," I said, not smiling. "Hi, Mom," Camille said, brushing past me without eye contact. "We just came by to get ahead of some things." "Before the week gets busy," Trevor added, as if this were a sales call and not a home invasion. I closed the door quietly behind them. "Would you like some tea?" "No, thanks," Camille said. "This won't take long." Trevor opened the folder and laid it on the kitchen counter without asking. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was titled Preliminary Property Valuation, Barrett Residence, my house. "We had an appraiser come by," he said, flipping the first page toward me. "Just an informal assessment, nothing binding." "And without my permission," I replied. He offered the kind of grin men use when they think you've missed the point. "We figured you'd appreciate us being proactive." "About what exactly?" Camille finally looked at me. "About listing the house, getting it on the market while the numbers are still good. You'll get more now than you will 6 months from now." "And where do you suppose I'll be 6 months from now?" I asked, setting my teacup down without sipping. "We just assumed you were already planning something," Trevor said. "Something smaller, more manageable. You mentioned before that this place is full of memories." "Memories don't pay heating bills," Camille added, as if quoting something I'd once said in passing. They were so certain, so smooth. I watched them talk as if they were narrating my future for a brochure. Elegant downsizing for the modern widow. Quiet, scenic, affordable. No mortgage, no legacy, no power. I nodded once, slowly, then walked to the secretary desk in the corner and pulled open the top drawer. The envelope was already there waiting. Pale blue, Mrs. Patterson's handwriting in the corner. I handed it to Trevor. "If you're going to make decisions, you'll want the full picture." He opened it, still smiling like he thought I'd written them a permission slip. But by the time he reached the second page, his expression had curdled. Camille stepped closer. "What is it?" Trevor handed her the documents without a word. She scanned them, slower than him. Her brow tightened line by line. "This says the house was mortgaged," she said finally. "It was. By Dad. Yes. And the funds were transferred directly into the trust," I said. "Legally, irrevocably, 18 months ago." Camille blinked. "So the house is encumbered?" Trevor's jaw tightened. "It's collateral." "That's one word for it," I said. Camille set the papers down like they were warm. "Why would he do that?" "Because he knew what was coming," I said simply. "He saw what I didn't, and he made sure the house couldn't be turned into a bargaining chip." Trevor crossed his arms. "This doesn't change the fact that you're living here." "No," I agreed, "but it changes the fact that you thought you were selling it out from under me." They stood there, the two of them, dressed for control. Tailored coats, crisp intentions, expensive shoes polished to outshine conscience. But they'd walked into a house they thought was an inheritance and found themselves in a courtroom instead. They came for an estate. I showed them a contract. "It's all very straightforward," I said. "I'm the trust's beneficiary. The mortgage was legal. The funds were transferred. The assets are protected." Trevor didn't speak. He just picked up the documents and flipped through them again, as if somewhere between the signatures and the seals he might find a loophole. Camille, though, just stared at me. She wasn't angry yet. That would come later. Right now she looked confused, like she was realizing for the first time that I wasn't the woman who needed rescuing from grief. I was the woman holding the deed, the trust, the paper trail. I wasn't the burden they'd inherited. I was the obstacle they'd underestimated. They came back the next day with a folder of their own. This time Camille brought coffee, an olive branch in a recycled cardboard cup, and Trevor brought the same overconfidence he always mistook for professionalism. They didn't knock, again, just walked in like they were already practicing for ownership. Camille placed the coffee on the table like it was a gift that would soften me. "It's vanilla oat milk," she said. "Your favorite." It wasn't. Trevor laid his folder next to it and cleared his throat. "We've had a look at the will." I waited. "It confirms," he continued, "that Camille is the executor of the estate. That includes personal effects, any remaining assets, and the house." He said it like it was a closing argument, like I'd been outvoted on something I hadn't even known we were deciding. "Executor," I repeated. Camille nodded. "Dad listed me legally. You're mentioned, of course, jewelry, photographs, sentimental things." "Sentimental things," I echoed. "That's what he left me?" "Don't take it that way, Mom," she said, tone tight with practiced empathy. "It's not about you. It's about simplicity, legal clarity. I didn't smile. I didn't reach for the coffee. I reached instead for the envelope on the table beside me, the one with the trust documents, again. Then you must have missed this. Trevor let out a breath. We're familiar with the will, Evelyn. I'm sure you are, I said, sliding the documents toward them. But this isn't the will. This is the trust. Camille glanced at the heading, confused. What trust? Trevor's expression sharpened. Barrett Living Trust, he read aloud. Established 2019. I nodded. The will you're holding outlines Thomas's personal effects, the watches, the books, the garden tools he swore he'd sharpen every spring. But the trust, this, is something else entirely. What are you saying? Camille asked. I'm saying the house, the business, the accounts, none of them fall under the estate. They were all transferred into the trust 5 years ago, before he died. Trevor straightened. That's not possible. A trust like this, there'd have to be financial restructuring, legal transitions, signatures. There were, I said gently. I signed them. At the bank. Years ago. Thomas told me it was routine paperwork, address updates, small account changes. And I believed him. Back then, I believed everything he told me. I thought I was being shielded from complexity. I didn't know he was quietly handing me the keys to my future. Camille frowned. But why wouldn't he tell me? Maybe because you never asked, I said. Or maybe because he saw what you'd do if you thought it was all yours. The room fell quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel like absence anymore, but confrontation. Trevor flipped through the documents quickly now, scanning paragraphs. This language, it gives full discretion to the trustee over all trust assets. It does, I said. And that's you? Yes. You control everything? Everything that matters. I could feel Camille's mind trying to assemble the pieces. She was an organizer, always had been. Color-coded schedules, stacked to-do lists. But this was one puzzle she hadn't seen coming, and there was no missing piece, just a picture they never thought I'd hold. You don't understand, Mom, she said quietly. This is going to create conflict. No, I said. It's going to reveal it. Trevor looked up from the folder. So what? You're keeping everything? The house? The business? You're not even going to talk about distribution? I studied them both, the way people study a chessboard right before they make a move. Slow, steady, unapologetic. You two read a will, but you didn't read the rest. They counted on ignorance, but I had the documents. They thought grief would cloud my judgment. That age would make me pliable. That sentiment would soften me. But Thomas had left me more than tea sets and photo albums. He'd left me structure, boundaries, a legal inheritance made of numbers, not nostalgia. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And for the first time in years, I was reading the fine print, out loud. I should have waited for them to leave. That would have been the gracious thing, the quiet, passive, well-mannered thing. But I had spent a lifetime doing the gracious thing, and it had earned me exactly one folder full of sentimental items and a cup of coffee I didn't order. So instead, I walked over to the filing drawer by the living room window, pulled out a pale yellow envelope, and placed it on the table between us. Trevor looked down at it like it might contain anthrax. What's this? He asked. Loan records, I said calmly. From Barrett Property Group, all legally documented, all signed by you. Camille blinked. What loans? Trevor didn't answer. His eyes were already moving across the first page. Darla had included everything. Loan titles, dates, amounts, payment terms, accrued interest, and status. The word delinquent showed up more times than I could count. So did Trevor's signature. Camille leaned in, her voice clipped. What loans, Trevor? He didn't respond right away. Just flipped to the next page, then the next. I could see the color drain from his face. $61,375, I said evenly. Over 5 years, from the business, to you. All unpaid. Camille turned to him, eyes wide. You said your father was investing in your ideas. You said he believed in you. He did, Trevor said. These weren't loans. They were arrangements. No, I said. They were contracts. He shot me a glare. So what, you're collecting now? No, I said. I'm informing. Trevor snapped the folder shut. You've been planning this, sitting on it like some kind of trap. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't even know about these until 2 days ago. Your father handled everything. He protected the business. And me. Camille crossed her arms. So what, Mom? You're going to sue your own daughter and her husband? I'm going to make decisions, I said, with full information, just like your father would have. She stood up. This is manipulation. No, I said, rising slowly, my voice steady. Your father gave me a spine, not a sword. Camille flinched like I'd slapped her. But I hadn't. I'd only spoken the truth. Thomas hadn't armed me to hurt people. He'd prepared me to stand when no one else would offer a seat. And now I was standing, in the middle of my own living room, holding a file folder that proved I was more than someone to be packed up and priced out. They called me a burden, I said softly. Turns out, I was their creditor. Trevor stood too. You're using this as leverage. No, I said. You already did. You leveraged my grief, my trust, my home, my silence. I'm just letting you know the credit line is closed. Camille's face reddened. You think this makes you strong? Holding this over us? You think Dad would have wanted this? Your father, I said, wanted me to be safe. He wanted the business he built to remain intact, and he wanted the people who took from it to be accountable. Trevor shook his head. This is ridiculous. No, I said. This is legal. There's a difference. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look away. I simply held my ground, like Thomas used to when someone tried to haggle on a house he knew was worth more than the asking price. Then what now? Camille asked, quieter now. You plan to take us to court? I sighed. I don't plan anything right now, except to finish my tea. Maybe call Darla, review the trust with the lawyer, and sit in the garden, which is still mine, by the way. They didn't speak, because for once they had nothing to say. I gathered the folder and slid it back into the drawer. You can let yourselves out, I said, moving toward the hallway. But take your time. Walk through the house. Look at the wallpaper, the window panes, the corners you didn't build, and the ceilings you never painted. I paused. Because the next time you come back, you'll do it as guests, not heirs. They left in silence, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt like mine again. Not because I'd reclaimed it, but because I'd remembered what it was built on. Not sentiment, not obligation, but truth, and names on paper, and one woman who finally knew what her worth was. I didn't expect them to come back so soon, but less than 48 hours later, there they were, standing on my porch in the same trench coats, the same stiff expressions, as if the past week had simply been a scheduling error we could now tidy up with fresh paperwork. This time, I left the door open. You're lucky we didn't call first, Trevor said, stepping in like he was still entitled to the square footage. You're lucky I unlocked the door, I replied, motioning them toward the kitchen. Camille sat down without being asked. Her hands were folded, but her jaw was set. We talked to a lawyer, she said. Good, I replied, setting down my tea. So did I. Trevor raised an eyebrow. You're lawyering up now? No, I said. I've had legal counsel for years. The same one who drafted the trust, the transfer agreements, and, more recently, reviewed the loan documentation you signed. Camille flinched. Trevor didn't. Okay, he said. Then let's get to the point. What do you want? I looked at him, then at her, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like someone's mother or someone's inconvenience. I felt like someone with terms. I want you to stay, I said carefully. If that's what you still want. Camille blinked. What? I'm offering you an arrangement. You want to remain in this family's orbit? Fine, but it comes with conditions. Trevor crossed his arms. Such as? You begin repaying the debt, I said. We set up a formal repayment schedule, legal agreements, installments, no more silence and no more favors disguised as family loyalty. Camille's voice cracked. Are you serious? I nodded. Dead serious. Trevor let out a breath and pushed away from the table. You've lost your mind. No, I said. I've finally found it. He paced to the far side of the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck like he was solving a math problem that kept changing its terms. Camille sat still, staring at the wood grain of the table. This is extortion, she said finally. You're holding our relationship hostage. No, I said. I'm holding my dignity intact. You asked me to leave my home, called me a burden, treated me like a liability to be processed. And now you want revenge? Trevor snapped. I stood, slowly, calmly. You asked me to leave, I said. And I didn't argue. I walked out with my grief and my silence. But here's the thing. Grief passes. Silence breaks. Trevor grabbed his coat. We're not going to be blackmailed by a woman with a folder and a memory. No, I replied. You're going to be held accountable by a woman with a lawyer and a ledger. He opened the door. Camille hesitated. Her voice was quieter this time. You really won't reconsider? I already have, I said. More times than I can count. And every time I found the same answer. I'd rather be alone with my truth than surrounded by people who only love me when I'm quiet. Trevor looked at her. Let's go. Camille lingered one moment longer. Her eyes scanned the room, the counter where I used to bake birthday cakes, the chair where her father always read the Sunday paper. She didn't say goodbye. She just left. The screen door clicked shut behind them. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't watch from the window to see if they turned around. Instead, I poured a fresh cup of tea and opened the folder from my lawyer. There it was, in clean type. In the event of challenge to the trust, the trustee reserves all legal rights. They thought I would beg to stay. Instead, I offered them the courtesy of doing the same. They declined, but they were the ones who suggested an exit. I simply pointed to the door. The house was small, modest, the kind of place realtors call charming because there isn't enough square footage to say anything else. But it had a view of the sea, and for the first time in a very long time, I had no one telling me which walls should be gray or which furniture matched the resale value. The deed was tucked inside a file marked Barrett Living Trust, Coastal Property. Darla had handed it to me with a soft smile and no commentary, though her eyes said everything. He bought it for me, quietly, carefully, months before his health began to fail. The trust had purchased it outright, no mortgage. He listed it as a retreat investment property in the legal documentation. But the linen curtains and soft oak floors told a different story. So did the clawfoot tub he knew I always wanted but never asked for. And the blue-painted kitchen cabinets, exactly the color of the teacup I kept beside our garden chair. It wasn't just a house. It was an apology, a promise, a final act of listening. They took comfort. I took control, and I moved in. The first night I lit a candle, not because I needed light, but because I needed softness. The second night I opened every window, let the salt air fill the rooms, and slept without earplugs, without fear of raised voices or footsteps that felt like thunder. By the end of the first week, I had painted the bedroom a muted sage green and hung up a watercolor print I'd bought from a local artist years ago, but never displayed because Camille said it clashed with the living room palette. There was no one here to clash with now, only tide and time and whatever music I decided to play in the background. The house came with just enough furniture to feel grounded and just enough emptiness to let me breathe. I chose curtains without consulting anyone, rearranged the bookshelves without justifying it, bought a lemon tree in a ceramic pot for the back porch, even though I had no idea how to care for it. I was learning, not about lemons, but about ownership, not just of land or walls, but of breath, of space, of self. The business still ran, quietly, behind the scenes. Darla sent me a monthly update, nothing extravagant, just a one-page PDF that included rental income, partnership payouts, and the current valuation of the remaining properties. We'd sold 2, renovated 1, the rest were stable. I didn't need to lift a finger, but I did anyway. I made one call to our tenants to introduce myself. I sent a holiday card to the property manager. I updated the office voicemail to include my name. Not Mrs. Barrett, not the late owner's wife, just Evelyn. I sometimes stood on the back deck in the early morning, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the ocean stretch and fold like an old, breathing soul. It never asked questions, never demanded answers. It didn't care who had sat at which table or signed which deed. It just existed. And in doing so, reminded me that I did too. For 40 years, I lived in homes that weren't entirely mine, rooms arranged around someone else's ambitions, decor approved by resale logic, comfort weighed against appearances. My voice, when it came to wallpaper or window treatments, was always considered, but never final. Now, if I wanted to hang a print of a woman standing alone in a red coat by a windswept cliff, I did. If I wanted silence at dinner time, I had it. If I wanted scrambled eggs for dinner on a Thursday, no one raised an eyebrow. And if I wanted to write a check to the community center that helped women like me learn legal literacy after a spouse passed, well, I could. Because I wasn't dependent. I was the trustee. I was the owner. And for the first time, I was also the designer of my own space. Camille hadn't called. Neither had Trevor. The silence didn't ache. It clarified. Because oceans don't judge. They just roll in, roll out, and leave behind shells that survived the storm. I was one of them. It arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, no perfume. Just a plain white envelope with my name spelled correctly for the first time in years. I almost didn't open it. It had been 5 months since they walked out. 5 months since Camille turned her back without even checking if the door closed all the way behind her. 5 months of salt air, clean linens, and silence that didn't bite. But I opened it anyway. The handwriting was hers, still slightly dramatic, like it was auditioning for sympathy. Mom, I've been in therapy. It was Trevor's idea, but I kept going after he stopped. I've learned a lot. About projection, about control, about the way grief can turn into blame when you're too scared to feel it. She had always been articulate when it suited her. Her father once called it her charm defense. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for what I didn't say. You didn't deserve to hear those things. Not after everything you gave up for us. Everything I gave up. Not shared, not discussed. Gave up. It wasn't new information. Just newly acknowledged. I've also spoken to a financial counselor. I understand more now about the business, about the trust, about what Dad did and why. I could see the line she wouldn't cross. She hadn't said the word debt. She hadn't said stealing. She hadn't said repayment. Just understand. Which is often what people offer when accountability is still too heavy to carry. I hope we can talk someday. I miss you. She underlined the word miss, twice. And then, love, Camille. No sign of Trevor. No mention of his name. Not even a passive we. Just her. I folded the letter carefully, not out of sentiment, but out of habit. I'd once folded permission slips, birthday money, and notes to her piano teacher with the same precision. I placed it back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer beside the matches and the grocery list pad I rarely use now. I didn't cry, because some letters are written for the sender, not the recipient. She thought this would be a bridge. But I had already built one, out of silence and bricks no one thought I could lift. I had walked across it months ago, and I wasn't standing on the other side waving a welcome flag. I had a lemon tree to water, a book club meeting that evening, a monthly rental report that showed the business was up 9% year over year. Camille, for the first time in her life, had to live without a script she could rewrite in her favor. I understood regret, but regret, when it comes late, wears the wrong shoes. It stomps across tile floors after the carpets have been replaced. It tracks in dust from doors no longer open. I didn't need her apology. I needed the space her absence gave me. The letter sat in the drawer like a monument, not to forgiveness, not to reconciliation, but to the gap between what is said and what is meant. Camille might one day believe that writing those words made her brave. But writing is easy. Living different is hard. Later that week, I walked down to the beach and let the wind speak louder than memory. A child was flying a kite with her grandfather. The string tugged against the wind, but he held it steady, patient. That was Thomas, holding everything steady, even when I didn't know he was. I whispered a quiet thank you into the breeze. Not for the house, not for the trust, but for teaching me how to stay upright when the people you love start to wobble. Apologies written in ink rarely erase intentions carved in stone. Camille had carved hers deep. And now I carved my boundaries deeper, not out of bitterness, but out of peace. Because love, too, needs locks and ledgers. And I finally had both. The invitation came printed on cream cardstock, elegant and modest, like someone had whispered empowerment into paper. It was from a local women's resource group, hosted every third Thursday in a borrowed library room overlooking the marina. The letter said they were building community through financial clarity, and that someone had recommended me as a guest speaker. I almost said no. I wasn't a speaker. I was a widow, a woman with a lemon tree and a list of betrayals that still echoed on quiet nights. But something about that phrase, building community, stuck. Not breaking, not surviving, building. I wore navy that day, simple slacks. A blouse Thomas once said made me look capable and dangerous, in the way he admired. The room held 20 chairs, mostly filled by women who had been told they were lucky to be kept, grateful to be carried, or too emotional to understand money. Some had just lost husbands, others had just found their courage, and a few were still pretending their marriages were held together by more than routine. They weren't there to be rescued, they were there to learn. I didn't start with my story, I started with the numbers. 1 in 3 widowed women over 60 discovers hidden debt, I said. 3 heads nodded, 1 scribbled notes. No one looked surprised. I continued. 80% of married women will outlive their spouses, yet more than half say they weren't involved in financial planning during the marriage. A quiet hum went through the room, not shock, recognition. And then I told them about the day my son-in-law asked me to pack my things like I was an unpaid tenant in my own grief, about the trust my husband left behind, the business, the records, about the loans I didn't know I'd be repaid for, and the silence I chose to break, one boundary at a time. I'm not here to tell you to mistrust your family, I said, but I am here to tell you not to confuse love with liability, or sacrifice with silence. A woman in the back exhaled sharply. Document everything, I added. Even the things you think you'll never need. A pause. Because someday, someone may ask you to prove you belonged. I shared what Darla had taught me, how to read a ledger, how to ask questions before signing, how to understand the difference between a will and a trust, and why both matter. I told them how financial literacy is not betrayal, it's protection. Afterward, 3 women stayed behind. One had just buried her husband and discovered a second mortgage. Another had never opened a bank account in her name. The third was in the middle of a divorce and whispered, "He says I never contributed, but the house is in my name." I gave her my lawyer's card, and I didn't whisper back. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket and the leftover banana bread someone had brought to the meeting. I wasn't glowing with pride. I was grounded in something sturdier, usefulness. Because for years, I thought my purpose ended with the laundry cycle, the dinner reservations, the thank you notes, and the way I smoothed over holidays that cracked at the edges. Now I taught women how to protect their worth in writing, how to trace paper trails before someone tries to rewrite the ending. Camille hadn't come. I didn't expect her to. But I mentioned her, not by name, just by pattern. She said I was Dad's burden, I told the group. But I was actually the one carrying the ledger that protected him. Some women cry in silence. Others learn to speak for the silenced, for the woman who never asked about the deed, for the wife who signed the papers without reading them, for the mother told she was selfish for asking what the family business paid. I didn't shout. I didn't scold. I just stood there, with my file folders, my lawyer's number, and a voice I didn't borrow. And for once, people listened. Not because I demanded it, but because I had proof, and because I finally believed I was worth hearing. The ocean didn't roar that evening. It hummed. a low, rhythmic breath that washed over the porch railing like it was trying to soothe something, though I no longer needed soothing. I sat in the armchair closest to the window, barefoot, the hem of my linen pants brushing against my ankles. The sky was all fire and surrender, rose gold and burnt apricot stretching across the water like a silk ribbon. It was the kind of sunset you could miss if you were too busy arguing about things that didn't matter. I'd missed too many like this already. Not anymore. On the side table beside me sat a single glass of Chardonnay. Not the brand Trevor once insisted was more palatable for guests. This was my choice. Light, crisp, and from a vineyard I found myself on a spontaneous drive along the coast. No maps, no permission slips, just me, the open road, and a debit card with my name printed alone. I lifted the glass and held it up toward the horizon, not in a toast to endings but to endurance. To Thomas, I whispered, for loving me in advance. He had done what so few ever think to do. He protected me after he was gone, not with poetry, not with promises, but with paperwork. He didn't assume love would be enough. He made sure I didn't have to beg for the home I built or barter for the respect I'd earned. He trusted that if the world turned cruel, I'd remember where the ledgers were kept. And I had. People ask me if I forgave them, Camille and Trevor. But forgiveness is such a noisy word. It demands a performance, a reckoning, a reconciliation that may not be safe or fair or even deserved. I didn't forgive them. I released them. There's a difference. Forgiveness says, I see you. Release says, I no longer need you to see me. Trevor never sent a word. Not a text, not a letter. Camille tried again once. A voicemail that began with, you don't have to call back, and ended with, I think about you every day. She didn't ask for money. She didn't mention the trust. And yet she still hadn't said the thing that mattered most. Not I'm sorry I chose him over you. Not I wish I'd asked what you needed instead of assuming you had nothing left to give. Just I think about you. Well, I think about her too. But thoughts aren't contracts. And regret isn't rent. The sun dipped lower. I didn't blink. Because there's something about coastal light that teaches you not to flinch. It arrives. It dazzles. It disappears. But it always returns. The house behind me was quiet, not hollow. The lemon tree had blossomed. The business continued to hum along, thanks to Darla's management. And every so often, I'd receive a handwritten thank you note from a woman who heard me speak, tucked inside a legal pad or a donation receipt to the local shelter. None of them knew about Camille or Trevor, but they knew about survival, about reinvention, about what it means to sign your name to your own life after decades of using someone else's ink. Freedom doesn't come from forgiveness. It comes from knowing you were always enough. Enough to be protected. Enough to be trusted. Enough to stand alone, not as an exile, but as an example. As the sun disappeared into the sea, I took one final sip and turned slightly toward the camera, the way you do when you're not just telling a story, but passing on a warning. And now I want to ask softly from you, have you ever had to protect yourself from your own family? Not to accuse, just to ask. Because I already know the answer.